"Go ahead," Edward Langford said without looking up from his glass, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Let's see if she even understands what I just said." The words floated across the table in a crisp, unfamiliar language, sharp consonants cutting through the low hum of the restaurant like glass tapping against crystal, and for a brief second, everything around them seemed to slow, the soft jazz in the background, the muted clinks of silverware, the quiet murmur of conversations folding into one another under warm amber lighting that reflected off polished marble floors and dark wood panels. Naomi Carter stood still beside the table, her order pad resting lightly in her hand, the edge of it brushing against her fingers as if grounding her in place, her black apron neatly tied, her name tag catching a sliver of light that flickered as she shifted her weight ever so slightly. And though her face remained calm, almost unreadable, there was a subtle tightening in her chest, not from confusion, not from embarrassment, but from recognition, because she understood every word, every syllable wrapped in that foreign cadence, every intention. Carefully hidden beneath what Edward clearly assumed was a barrier no one like her could cross. Around him, the men at the table exchanged quiet smirks, their shoulders relaxed in that casual confidence that comes from knowing the room bends around you. One of them leaning back in his chair with a faint chuckle, another swirling the ice in his drink as if waiting for a reaction, for hesitation, for the small crack in composure that would confirm their quiet assumption that she was exactly what they thought she was. Just another waitress. Just another invisible presence moving between tables carrying plates and polite smiles. Naomi didn't move right away, and that stillness stretched just long enough to be noticed. Just long enough for Edward's lips to curl slightly at the corner. Not quite a smile. More like the beginning of one. The kind that came from control, from expectation, from believing the moment had already unfolded exactly as he intended. The overhead chandelier cast a soft glow across the table, catching the silver edges of cutlery and the rim of his glass. And in that reflection, Naomi could see him without directly looking. His posture relaxed, his confidence unshaken, his attention already drifting as if the outcome had been decided the second he spoke. A server passed behind her carrying a tray of drinks, the faint scent of citrus and oak brushing through the air, grounding her further in the present. And somewhere near the bar, a burst of laughter rose and faded, blending back into the ambient rhythm of the room. Naomi inhaled slowly, the fabric of her uniform shifting slightly with the movement, her fingers tightening just enough on the pen in her hand to feel its edges, and then releasing, steady again, controlled, deliberate, her eyes lowering briefly to the notepad as if reviewing something routine, something ordinary. Even as her mind traced the structure of his sentence, the subtle error in pronunciation, the misplaced emphasis that altered the meaning just enough to reveal more than he intended. She had heard that tone before, not just in words, but in silence, in the spaces people left between assumptions, in the way eyes skimmed past her as if she were part of the furniture, and yet there was something almost predictable about it now, something that no longer unsettled her the way it once might have. Because this wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, and it wouldn't be the last. Edward finally looked up, just a glance, brief but intentional, as if checking whether the moment had landed, whether the effect had taken hold. And when he saw her still standing there, composed, unflustered, something flickered across his expression. Curiosity, maybe, or the faintest hint of impatience. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Naomi lifted her gaze. Not sharply, not confrontationally, just enough to meet the space in front of him without fully meeting his eyes, her posture straight, her presence quiet but undeniable, and in that suspended moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to dim again, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next, unaware that the balance of power at that table had already begun to shift in a way none of them had expected. Naomi Carter had learned early that silence could be mistaken for ignorance, and sometimes that was exactly what people wanted to believe. She had grown up in a small apartment above a laundromat in Newark, where the hum of dryers never really stopped, and the air always carried a faint warmth of soap and steam, her mother working double shifts, her voice always tired but gentle, reminding Naomi that dignity was something no one could take unless you handed it to them yourself. And even now, standing in a restaurant where a single dinner cost more than a week of groceries back then. That lesson sat steady in her chest like a quiet anchor. Her eyes lowered again to the notepad, but she was not writing, not yet, instead tracing the memory of syllables he had spoken. The structure of the sentence folding back into place in her mind with practiced precision, because language had never been just words to her. It had been escape. It had been structure. It had been the one place where rules made sense even when people did not. The first time she heard Hungarian was not in a classroom, but through an old lecture video she found online, the professor speaking slowly, carefully, explaining how a single shift in pronunciation could reshape meaning entirely. And Naomi had replayed that clip over and over late at night, earbuds in, the glow of her phone lighting her face while the rest of the apartment slept, her notebook filled with careful notes, translations, and phonetic marks written in ink that sometimes smudged when her hands got tired. Later, when she earned her place at Columbia University, it felt less like luck and more like confirmation, like all those quiet nights had been building towards something real, something that had weight. And for a while, walking across campus with books pressed against her chest, hearing different languages drift across courtyards and lecture halls, she allowed herself to believe that she had stepped into a future where she would be seen for what she knew, not dismissed for what people assumed. But life had a way of interrupting even the most carefully built paths, and when her mother's health began to fail, the hospital visits stacking up, the bills arriving faster than answers, Naomi did not hesitate. She withdrew. She returned. She traded lecture halls for long shifts and steady paychecks, because survival did not wait for degrees to be finished. Now, back in the present, the restaurant lights felt warmer than the fluorescent glare of hospital corridors, but the same quiet calculations remained in her mind, always measuring, always aware of what mattered in the moment. And right now, what mattered was not proving anything to anyone at that table, not seeking approval or recognition, but choosing how to respond in a way that aligned with who she was, not who they expected her to be. Edward shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the side of his glass, a small, impatient rhythm, and one of the men beside him leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to sound discreet, but not enough to be unheard, asking if she needed help understanding the order. The words wrapped in politeness but edged with assumption, and Naomi caught it, the tone more than the words, the familiar layering of courtesy over condescension. She lifted her head just a fraction more this time, her gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, simply present, and for a brief moment, her reflection caught in the polished surface of the table, a faint outline of her face beside theirs, equal in that mirrored space, if nowhere else. The pen in her hand felt balanced, light but precise, and she finally began to write, each movement deliberate, the soft scratch of ink against paper barely audible beneath the ambient sound of the room, yet grounding, real, something she controlled completely. And as she finished noting the order exactly as it had been spoken, including the subtle mispronunciation that shifted its meaning, she paused, just long enough to let the moment breathe, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged, and when she looked up again, there was a quiet clarity in her expression, not defiance, not hesitation, but readiness, the kind that came not from impulse, but from knowing exactly what you were about to say and why it mattered. Edward Langford leaned back slightly in his chair, the faint creak of leather barely audible beneath the ambient hum of the dining room. His eyes now fixed on Naomi with a sharper focus than before, as if something in her stillness had interrupted the easy rhythm of his control, and for the first time since she approached the table, he was not entirely certain how the moment would unfold. The men around him shifted subtly, one adjusting his cufflinks, another lifting his glass, but not drinking, their earlier amusement thinning into curiosity, because the pause had stretched just long enough to feel different, just long enough to suggest that whatever came next might not follow the script they had already written in their minds. Naomi stood with quiet balance, the weight evenly distributed through her posture, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise to meet the room. It did not seek attention. It simply entered the space with clarity, measured and precise, each word shaped with the same careful intention she had used when she first learned to listen before speaking. She repeated his order back to him, but not in English, not softened, not simplified. She spoke in the same language he had used, her pronunciation clean, deliberate, carrying the correct rhythm and tone that gave each syllable its proper place. And for a brief second, the table froze again, not in amusement this time, but in something closer to surprise, because the difference was unmistakable. Even to those who did not understand the language itself, the confidence in her delivery cutting through the room like a line drawn with certainty. Edward's expression did not collapse, but it shifted, just slightly, the corner of his mouth tightening as his eyes narrowed with a focus that was no longer casual, no longer dismissive, and he straightened a fraction, setting his glass down with a controlled motion that was just firm enough to signal attention without admitting it. Naomi did not stop there. She allowed a small pause, just enough for the weight of what she had said to settle, and then she added a single sentence, still in that same language, her tone unchanged. But the structure corrected, the emphasis adjusted, the meaning refined, and though the words themselves were unfamiliar to most at the table, the reaction they provoked was immediate and visible, because one of the men leaned forward, his brows drawing together as if trying to reconcile what he had just heard, while another exchanged a quick glance with the person beside him, the unspoken question passing between them without sound. Edward's fingers stilled against the table, the subtle rhythm gone, replaced by a stillness that mirrored hers, but carried a different weight, one that came from recalculating rather than controlling, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt slightly in that invisible balance between assumption and reality, the space between who someone appears to be and who they actually are narrowing in a way that could not be easily ignored. Naomi met the space just in front of him again, her gaze steady but not confrontational. And in that quiet alignment, there was no trace of apology, no attempt to soften what had just occurred, only a calm presence that made no effort to shrink itself to fit the expectations placed upon it. Somewhere behind her, a server passed by with a tray, the faint scent of grilled salmon and lemon drifting through the air, the normal rhythm of the restaurant continuing as if nothing had changed, yet at that table, everything had shifted in a way that could be felt more than explained, and Edward, for the first time that evening, was no longer the only one in control of the moment. The air at the table shifted in a way that could not be smoothed over with a joke or a passing comment, and Edward Langford felt it before anyone said a word, the subtle tightening of attention from the men around him, the way their posture adjusted, no longer leaning back in effortless amusement, but leaning in, waiting, measuring, because something had just happened that did not fit the pattern they were used to. Edward's gaze stayed on Naomi now, no longer glancing, no longer dismissing, but studying. And when he spoke again, he did not return to English right away, instead choosing the same language, his tone more controlled this time, slower, as if precision might restore the ground he had just lost, but the slight hesitation between his words betrayed something else, something closer to caution. Naomi listened without interrupting, her head tilted just enough to signal attention, her expression unchanged. And when he finished, there was a brief pause, not empty, but full, the kind of silence that holds weight, the kind that forces everyone present to become aware of it. One of the men cleared his throat quietly, another shifted in his seat, and somewhere behind them a glass was set down a little too hard against a table, the sound sharp but quickly swallowed by the room, yet none of it broke the moment. Naomi responded again in the same language, her voice steady. But this time she did not simply repeat or correct, she explained, her words unfolding with a clarity that carried structure and intent, and even those who did not understand the language could hear the difference, the cadence of someone who was not guessing, not mimicking, but fully fluent, fully present in what she was saying. Edward's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, and when she finished, she allowed the words to settle before gently shifting back into English, her tone respectful, professional, but unmistakably direct, explaining that the phrasing he had used earlier did not say what he believed it did, that the emphasis he chose altered the meaning in a way that could be interpreted as dismissive rather than refined, and she offered the corrected version with a calm precision that left no room for misinterpretation. The table fell completely still, the earlier confidence now replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain, and one of the men, the one who had leaned forward earlier, gave a small nod almost involuntarily, as if acknowledging a point made in a language he did not fully understand but could still feel. Edward did not respond immediately. His fingers resting flat against the table now, no movement, no tapping, his attention fully anchored in the moment in front of him. And for the first time, there was no assumption in his expression, only evaluation. Naomi stood as she had from the beginning, composed, her presence neither shrinking nor expanding, simply holding its place. And in that stillness, there was a quiet authority that did not demand recognition but made it unavoidable. A server passed by again, the faint scent of butter and herbs trailing behind, and the soft glow of the chandelier above reflected in the glassware, unchanged. Ordinary. Yet at that table, the balance had shifted further, not with force, not with confrontation, but with something far more difficult to dismiss, the undeniable weight of truth delivered without raising a voice, without breaking composure, and without asking for permission. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like thin ice under weight, and Edward Langford felt the shift ripple outward from the center of the table. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, the kind of tension that settled into the space between people when something uncomfortable had been revealed and no one was quite sure how to step around it. One of the men cleared his throat again, this time louder, forcing a small laugh that did not quite land, his eyes flicking briefly toward Edward as if waiting for him to reclaim the moment, to reset the tone, to restore the familiar hierarchy they all depended on. But Edward did not move, not immediately, his gaze still fixed on Naomi, his expression controlled yet noticeably tighter, the ease gone from his posture as he leaned slightly forward, elbows near the edge of the table, his presence no longer expansive but concentrated. "That is impressive," he said finally, his voice measured, each word chosen with care, but there was a faint edge beneath it, not quite irritation, not quite disbelief, something more complex, something that came from being forced to reconsider a narrative he had already decided was true. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without absorbing their weight, her posture unchanged, her hands steady, the pen still resting lightly between her fingers as if this were just another order, just another table, just another moment in a long shift that would end like any other, except it would not anymore. Edward's eyes narrowed just enough to signal thought, calculation, and then he spoke again, this time in English, his tone shifting subtly towards something more probing, asking where she had learned the language. The question simple on the surface, but carrying an undertone that suggested surprise still lingering beneath his composure. And around the table, the others leaned in again, curiosity now replacing amusement, because the story in front of them had changed, and they wanted to understand how. Naomi paused for a fraction of a second, not because she did not have an answer, but because she chose how much of it to give. Her gaze steady, her voice calm as she replied that she had studied it in school, that she had spent years learning languages, not as a hobby, but as a discipline, her words delivered without emphasis, without performance, as if stating something ordinary, something that required no validation. One of the men raised his eyebrows slightly, exchanging a quick look with another, the silent recalibration continuing, and Edward exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled breath that seemed to settle something inside him, though not entirely. "And now you are here," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, the implication hanging in the air between them, subtle but present, the kind of observation that revealed more about the speaker than the subject. Naomi did not react to the implication, not outwardly, her expression remaining composed. But there was a quiet firmness in the way she held her posture, in the way her shoulders stayed relaxed yet grounded, as if she had already answered that question for herself long before this moment, long before this table, long before Edward Langford had ever spoken to her. "Yes," she said simply, her voice even, and in that single word, there was no apology, no explanation offered, only acceptance of where she stood and why. And the absence of justification seemed to land more heavily than any long answer could have. The table fell quiet again. But this time it was different, not tense in the same way, not waiting for a mistake, but absorbing, processing, and Edward leaned back slightly, his fingers finally lifting from the table as he reached for his glass, not to assert control, but almost as if to give himself a moment, the ice shifting softly as he moved it, the sound small yet clear in the stillness. Naomi remained where she was, composed, present, no longer invisible, and though no one said it aloud, the dynamic had changed in a way that could not be undone. The assumptions that had filled the space at the beginning of the evening now fractured, replaced by something far less comfortable and far more real. The moment did not escalate. It softened, stretching into something quieter, something more revealing, as the noise of the restaurant slowly returned to its natural rhythm, the faint hum of conversation rising again, the distant clink of silverware echoing gently against glass. And yet at that table, a different kind of stillness remained, one that settled deeper than sound. Naomi stood without shifting, her presence no longer something that could be overlooked, not because she demanded attention, but because she had already changed the way the space perceived her, and that kind of shift did not fade quickly. Edward Langford lifted his glass slightly, then paused before taking a sip, his eyes lowering for just a second, as if reviewing something internal, something that had not been challenged in a long time. And when he finally drank, it was slower, more deliberate, the movement less about habit and more about thought. Across from him, one of the men leaned back again, but not in the same relaxed way as before, his shoulders now carrying a subtle stiffness, as if the comfort of certainty had been replaced by something less stable, something that required attention. Another guest adjusted his napkin, glancing briefly at Naomi, then away, not dismissive this time, but thoughtful, as if seeing her fully for the first time required a quiet recalibration of everything that had come before. The chandelier above cast a steady glow, its light reflecting off the polished surfaces, creating soft highlights along the edges of glasses and plates. And in that reflection, Naomi's name tag caught the light again. Carter, briefly illuminated before fading back into shadow, a small detail, but one that seemed to carry more weight now than it had moments earlier. Naomi's fingers relaxed slightly around the pen, the tension she had held not out of fear, but out of readiness easing just enough to allow a breath. A quiet inhale that expanded her chest, and then released slowly, grounding her again in the present, in the simple act of standing, of being, of choosing not to shrink even when the room had expected her to. Edward set his glass down gently this time, the sound barely audible, and when he looked up again, there was something different in his gaze, not defeat, not apology, but awareness, the kind that comes when a perspective shifts just enough to make old assumptions feel incomplete. He glanced briefly at the others at the table, then back at Naomi, and for a moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing immediate to say that would restore the old balance, and perhaps, for the first time that evening, there was no need to. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She did not step away prematurely. She simply remained, steady and composed, allowing the moment to exist without forcing it forward. And in that stillness, there was a quiet strength that did not rely on recognition, only on presence. Somewhere near the entrance, the door opened, letting in a faint draft of cooler air that brushed through the room, carrying with it the subtle scent of the city outside, distant traffic, a hint of rain on pavement, and for a brief second, it felt like a reminder that the world beyond this table continued unchanged, even as something small but significant had shifted within it. Edward finally spoke again, his voice lower now, less performative, more measured, asking her to proceed with the order, the words simple, but the tone stripped of its earlier edge, and Naomi gave a slight nod, acknowledging without emphasizing, her movement smooth as she turned just enough to prepare to step away. But before she moved, there was one last pause, not imposed, not forced, simply there. And in that pause, the imbalance that had defined the beginning of the evening no longer held the same weight, replaced instead by something quieter, something more balanced, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Naomi turned slightly, the movement smooth and unhurried, her steps measured as she began to walk away from the table, the soft soles of her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. And yet before she could fully leave the space behind, a voice stopped her, not loud, not commanding, but deliberate enough to reach her clearly. "Wait," Edward said, and the single word carried a different weight than anything he had said before. Stripped of performance, stripped of assumption, leaving only intention. Naomi paused, not immediately turning, allowing the moment to settle before she shifted her gaze back toward him, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but attentive. Edward did not speak right away, and that hesitation, brief as it was, did not go unnoticed by the others at the table, because it was unfamiliar, the absence of immediate control, the presence of thought. He glanced down for a second, then back up, and when he spoke again, his tone was quieter, more grounded, as if he had stepped out of the role he usually occupied and into something more direct, asking her, this time without implication, where exactly she had studied. The question no longer framed as curiosity wrapped in disbelief, but as something closer to genuine interest. Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment, then answered simply, stating the university name without embellishment, without emphasis, letting the words stand on their own. One of the men at the table straightened slightly, recognition flickering across his face, and another let out a soft exhale, as if something had just connected in his mind that he had not expected to consider. Edward nodded once, slowly, absorbing the answer, and for a moment, he did not speak, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but reflective, as if he was recalibrating something internal that had been left unexamined for too long. You left, he said after a beat, not as an accusation, but as an observation. And Naomi responded with the same calm clarity, explaining that she had needed to, that life required choices that did not always align with plans, her voice steady, without regret, without defense. The words settled between them, and Edward's expression shifted again, softer now, the sharp edges of certainty replaced by something more human, something that acknowledged the reality of her path without reducing it. One of the men at the table leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly against the surface, his earlier posture of casual superiority gone, replaced by a quiet attentiveness, as if he was witnessing something that extended beyond the moment itself. Edward exhaled slowly, then gave a small nod, almost to himself, before speaking again, this time not in the foreign language, not in a tone meant to test or challenge, but in clear, direct English, thanking her, not elaborately, not performatively, but sincerely, the kind of acknowledgement that did not seek to undo what had happened, but recognized what had been revealed. Naomi inclined her head slightly, accepting the words without holding on to them, her presence still grounded, still steady, and in that exchange, something settled into place, not dramatically, not with applause or reaction, but quietly, firmly. Edward leaned back once more, but this time the movement was different, not reclaiming space, but releasing it, allowing the moment to exist without needing to control it. And around the table, the others followed that shift, their posture easing, their attention no longer fixed on hierarchy, but on understanding. Naomi turned again, this time continuing her path without interruption, her steps carrying her away from the table, but the impact of the moment remained behind, lingering in the air like a subtle change in temperature, something that could be felt even after she was no longer standing there, something that had altered the way each person at that table saw not only her, but themselves. The rhythm of the restaurant continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, plates arriving at nearby tables, quiet laughter rising and falling like a distant tide. But at Edward Langford's table, something subtle had settled into place, not loud enough to draw attention, yet strong enough to hold it. He remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze following the direction Naomi had walked, not in a way that demanded her return, but in a way that suggested he was still processing the space she had occupied, the presence she had left behind. One of the men across from him shifted in his chair and finally spoke, his voice lower now, lacking the earlier edge, remarking that he had not expected that. The statement simple, but carrying an acknowledgement that extended beyond language, and Edward gave a small nod, not dismissing it, not expanding on it, just allowing it to exist. Another guest adjusted his glass and added quietly that it was rare to be corrected that precisely, especially in a language most people at the table did not speak, and there was no laughter this time. Only a shared understanding that the moment had not been about embarrassment, but about clarity. Edward leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers loosely interlaced, and for a brief second, he looked at the reflection of the chandelier in the polished surface below. The light fractured into soft shapes, shifting with the slightest movement. And in that reflection, his own image seemed less defined than before, less certain. "We assume too quickly," he said, almost to himself, the words quiet, not meant to dominate the table, but to acknowledge something internal that had shifted, and no one immediately responded, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct, only something to consider. Across the table, a man who had earlier laughed now sat still, his expression thoughtful, his eyes no longer scanning the room for distraction, but resting on the space where Naomi had stood, as if trying to reconstruct the moment in his mind, to understand where his own assumptions had taken hold. Edward exhaled slowly, then reached for the menu again, not because he needed to review it, but because the familiar motion gave him a second to settle his thoughts, to return to the present without dismissing what had just occurred. When Naomi returned a few minutes later with water and a quiet, professional composure, the table greeted her differently, not with exaggerated politeness, not with forced acknowledgement, but with a subtle shift in tone, a natural respect that did not need to be announced. Edward looked up as she approached, and this time, there was no test in his eyes, no expectation of performance, only recognition, and he thanked her again, briefly, the words simple, but grounded, and Naomi responded with a small nod. Her expression unchanged, her presence steady as ever. She placed the glasses carefully, each movement precise, the soft sound of water filling crystal catching the light in small, shifting reflections, and as she stepped back, the space between them felt balanced in a way it had not before, not equal in position, but equal in acknowledgement. Edward leaned back once more, his posture now relaxed in a different way, not from dominance, but from acceptance, and as the conversation at the table slowly resumed, it carried a different tone, less performative, more measured, as if each person had become slightly more aware of the weight behind their words. Naomi turned and moved on to the next table, her steps quiet, her presence blending back into the flow of the restaurant. But the moment she had left behind remained, not as a disruption, but as a quiet correction, something that would not be spoken about again that night, yet would not be easily forgotten. By the time the evening began to settle into its later hours, the restaurant had softened into a quieter rhythm, the earlier energy giving way to a more subdued cadence of low conversations and dimmed lighting, and Naomi Carter moved through it with the same steady presence she had carried all night, her steps measured, her posture relaxed, her attention shifting naturally from table to table without hesitation. The moment at Edward Langford's table had already passed in the visible sense. Plates had been served, glasses refilled, conversations resumed, yet something of it remained beneath the surface, not spoken, not revisited, but present in the subtle changes that lingered in posture, in tone, in the way eyes followed her now not out of curiosity, but recognition. As she approached their table again to clear the first course, the movement was seamless, practiced, her hands precise as she lifted each plate with care, the soft clink of porcelain meeting tray barely audible against the ambient sound, and Edward looked up briefly, not interrupting, not directing, simply acknowledging her presence with a small nod that carried no expectation, no performance, only awareness. Naomi returned the nod just as quietly, her expression unchanged, her focus grounded in the task, and as she turned to leave, the reflection of the chandelier caught once more against her name tag, the letters of Carter, glowing for a brief second before fading back into shadow, a small detail, easily missed, yet somehow anchoring the moment in something real. Edward leaned back in his chair again, but this time the movement was not about space or control, it was about release, his shoulders settling as he exhaled slowly, the conversation around him continuing, yet no longer needing to dominate it. And as he listened to the others speak, his responses came measured, less reactive, more deliberate, as if the lens through which he viewed the room had shifted, slightly, just enough to notice what had always been there but rarely considered. Across from him, one of the men paused mid-sentence, then glanced briefly toward the direction Naomi had gone, not out of distraction, but reflection, as if the evening had quietly expanded beyond business, beyond routine, into something less defined but more meaningful. Naomi moved toward the back of the dining room, placing the cleared dishes down with practiced efficiency, the faint scent of warm food and polished wood surrounding her. And for a moment, she allowed herself a small breath, a quiet release that did not show on her face but settled in her chest, steady and calm. Not relief, not triumph, simply a return to balance. She adjusted the strap of her apron slightly, the fabric shifting against her waist, then turned back toward the floor, ready to continue, because the work did not pause for moments like that. It continued, steady and constant, just like she did, near the entrance. The glass doors reflected the city lights outside, faint streaks of red and white from passing cars blending into the dim interior glow. And as Naomi passed by, her reflection moved briefly alongside them, a quiet figure within a larger motion, neither separate nor diminished, simply present. At Edward's table, the conversation had fully resumed, yet it carried a different tone now, less hurried, less certain, more aware. And though no one named it, the shift remained, not as a disruption, but as a quiet correction that had settled into the space. Naomi continued through the room, her steps even, her gaze steady, and as she moved past table after table, the night carried on, unchanged in appearance, yet altered in something deeper, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, something that lingered in the silence between words, in the space between assumptions and truth, and in that space, her presence remained, calm, grounded, and undeniable. If this story stayed with you, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. In the next video, I will talk about the story, Billionaire mocked the black waitress in French. Seconds later, her reply left him silent. See you in the next video. Thank you for watching.